A place apart, a place of the heart. Since the late 1970s, when God led Officers Christian Fellowship to beautiful, tranquil Milligan's Cove, generations of OCFers have come to know White Sulphur Springs as a place like no other. Nestled in the Allegheny foothills, the 1,000-acre retreat and conference center beckons military men and women and their families to reconnect and to feel God's presence, power, and eternal love as they pause in their daily lives to reflect on and renew their faith. OCF assumed ownership of White Sulphur Springs in 1978, but a tradition of warm, godly hospitality actually took firm root in this area many decades earlier. During its 130-year existence, White Sulphur Springs has had just 3 owners, 3 devoted stewards who faced and overcame countless challenges to preserve and maintain it so that we can enjoy it today. First, the Colvin family from the Bedford, Pennsylvania area, followed by Paul and Patricia Cochran from Chicago, stood watch over 9 decades, from 1887 until OCF's arrival. Their spiritual and physical investments are reflected in the fact that the very same historic buildings that were hosting guests shortly after the Civil War are all still serving the OCF ministry as we move through the 21st century. So history doesn't need to be imagined at White Sulphur Springs. It's with us and part of us. We invite you during your stay to sample that history so that it might add to your appreciation of how the Lord has worked and is working in this quiet cove. But first, to help set the stage, let's look back at the legacy of hospitality now entrusted to OCF in this very special place apart, place of the heart. Ask any longtime resident of the Bedford area about White Sulphur Springs during its years as a public resort, and they'll probably smile as they recall sumptuous Sunday dinners, trips to the spring house for the aromatic sulphur water, the years they or loved ones worked at the hotel, and of course hours spent happily rocking on the wide front porch. For others who came from as far away as the Midwest and California, White Sulphur Springs is fondly remembered as a summertime vacation spot, the welcome reward for completing a long journey. A local tradition of hospitality long predates the stately 3-story white-sided building which today is OCF's Harrison House. Milligan's Cove, the geographical home to White Sulphur Springs, is a secluded valley 10 miles long and a mile wide, nestled between Wills and Buffalo Mountains. It was well known to Native American Indians for its mineral springs long before a 2-story log tavern was built in the late 1700s as a way station for drovers using a packer's path along the crest of Wills Mountain. That tavern was located near today's Buckingham Field. By the 1870s, the tavern had closed, but the growing popularity of the area's sulphur springs had prompted a number of local farms to open small hotels or boarding houses in the summer. One of these, the former Arlington Cottage Hotel, serves today as White Sulphur Springs staff housing. You pass it, a lovely gray house, as you enter or exit the cove. In the mid-1880s, the Reed and Lyon families, sensing the tourism potential of the popular spring they owned in Milligan's Cove, authorized construction of an adjacent hotel. Here we see the site just before the work began, with the spring in the foreground. The hotel was to be an ambitious structure, larger than anything in the immediate area. Originally it had 2 stories, with 24 bedrooms, a dining room, kitchen, and parlor, and outdoor sanitary facilities. On June 17, 1887, Alex Lowry of Butler, Pennsylvania, became the first paying guest. So many others followed that in 1894, the hotel's 3rd floor and a center wing were added, providing 20 more guest rooms, together with hot and cold sulphur baths and indoor bathrooms. A 2-story cottage was built next door to provide offices and overflow guest rooms. And across the street, a 2-lane bowling alley and barn were added. That same year, 1894, the first of the 3 long-serving White Sulphur Springs stewards assumed ownership. The Colvin family from nearby Shellsburg, 2 brothers and 5 sisters, had managed the hotel almost since its opening. In March of 1894, brothers Ross and Michael Colvin purchased the hotel and the surrounding 50 acres. Family Bibles in the White Sulphur Springs archives attest to the Colvins' faith, with Michael regarded as a pillar of the Shellsburg Presbyterian Church. A Colvin would own the hotel for the next 52 years until 1946. Today, OCF's Conference Center operates year-round, but for its first half-century, White Sulphur Springs was a summertime-only resort, with stays of weeks and sometimes months commonplace in a more leisurely era when guests relied on large steamer trunks for their wardrobes and other necessities. Travel then was different too. As you drive along the winding, wooded road into the cove, you're retracing the route which brought early guests to the hotel in a horse-drawn carriage from the tiny Sulphur Springs station of the Pennsylvania Railroad 2 miles away. For 50 years, the passenger train was the principal means of reaching the resort. The first automobile didn't arrive at White Sulphur Springs until August 14, 1903, and the train was still operating into the mid-1930s. The Colvin family members all took roles running the hotel, from reservations to food service to maintenance. Guests in the early 1900s dined at long tables where hearty meals were served family style. Bedrooms were furnished quite simply. Floors were exposed wood. The cost to stay? $7 a week and up. Visitors entertained themselves with a variety of activities. Lazy days were devoted to hiking the hills, playing lawn tennis on courts near the spring house, bowling, archery, horseshoes, or simply relaxing and contemplating God's timeless majesty from the hotel porch. Guests returned year after year, often requesting a favorite room. Air conditioning was provided by opening windows to the cool night air, and spring water was just a few steps away. Among the early guests was Patricia Patterson, daughter of an insurance executive and his musically gifted wife. Patricia's first visit in 1910 at age 5 was followed by many more, and it unknowingly set the stage for the next era of White Sulphur Springs stewardship. In 1931, Patricia married Paul Cochran, a World War I Army veteran and Chicago industrialist whose construction equipment was used in building the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Together, they returned often as guests to White Sulphur Springs during the following decade, with Paul sharing his wife's appreciation for this welcome departure from the hustle and bustle of Chicago's Gold Coast. But times were changing. The Depression and then the looming Second World War took their toll on the resort's business, even at the attractive room rate of $2.50 a day. In 1942, the last Colvin sibling, Michael, passed away. With no one to carry on ownership, Michael's widow Lorena closed the hotel. For 4 years it stood empty and dark, and lumber interests were closing in, intent upon harvesting the beautiful forests. It was then that Paul and Patricia Cochran were moved to take a leap of faith. In 1946, with no hotel management experience, they bought White Sulphur Springs and 150 acres of surrounding land and began a 4-year, $150,000 renovation and restoration. Lodging accommodations were reconfigured into 46 attractively furnished guest rooms. A basement was excavated, and in what is now the Johnson Room, a huge stone fireplace was constructed. On July 4, 1950, they reopened the resort, which they proceeded to operate until 1978. "We bought it to save the trees," Mrs. Cochran later explained. "We never intended to go into the hotel business. At first, we thought about tearing down part of the hotel and building a home for retirement, but our thinking started to change. The old hotel and the spring were far too precious." For the first several years of their ownership of White Sulphur Springs, the Cochrans relied on hired managers while they continued to live in Chicago and Findlay, Ohio, near Paul's factories. But by the early 1960s, their on-site presence was clearly needed. So Paul gave up his businesses, and they moved to Pennsylvania, keeping White Sulphur Springs open year-round for the first time. Patricia, a talented portrait and landscape painter, used her artistic abilities to decorate the hotel in what she called a comfortable colonial style. And she also squeezed in precious hours at her easel, creating oil paintings of people and landscapes, many of which now grace the walls of Harrison House and Heritage House. Both she and Paul loved horses, so Paul personally carved out a network of trails, and they started a horse program which is continued by OCF today. The new owners also added a swimming lake, fishing pond, and trap shooting, and they expanded the resort acreage to 550. Daily rates in the early 1950s were $11 for a single room and $22.50 for a double, including all meals. Mealtime was always a treat, with Mrs. Cochran personally overseeing the kitchen and menu. Dinners featured peanut soup, Smithfield ham, Delmonico steak, Blue Lake green beans, and homemade cakes and pies. At first, the Cochrans raised their own sheep, cattle, and vegetables, but soon demand outstripped supply. In the 1950s, the Cochrans decided to build a traditional Pennsylvania log house for meetings and parties, located behind the hotel. Construction techniques were the same as those followed when White Sulphur Springs first came to be in the 19th century. Teams of horses dragged to the building site logs hand-hewn from trees harvested nearby. Natural fieldstone from the area was used, and supposedly no nails were allowed, although local craftsmen have since admitted they sometimes cheated when the demanding Mrs. Cochran wasn't looking. 2 decades passed, and storm clouds again gathered around White Sulphur Springs in the 1970s. Vacation patterns were changing, placing serious stress on small, independently owned inns. Paul Cochran continued to struggle with a financial picture which, he admitted, had never been favorable. Having invested their life savings of $1 million in White Sulphur Springs, and now faced with illness and the fact they were both in their 70s, the Cochrans prayed for a buyer who would rescue the old resort and preserve it, just as they had been moved to do 30 years earlier. Once again, lumber companies began hovering and making lucrative offers. Then came the answer to their prayers. Officers Christian Fellowship, with its home office in Colorado, had long contemplated establishing an East Coast presence and had explored various locations. In 1977, former OCF President Rear Admiral Robert L. Bond, retired and living in Pennsylvania, learned that White Sulphur Springs might be for sale. Knowing of OCF's interest in an eastern location, he notified OCF leadership. Negotiations followed, and Paul and Patricia, impressed by OCF's faith and commitment, agreed to sell with the provision that they be allowed to remain at White Sulphur Springs, where they hoped to build a house one day. In the spring of 1978, 89 years after the hotel had opened, OCF purchased White Sulphur Springs to become its third steward. The first ministry seminars were conducted that same summer. In November of that year, Paul Cochran joined the Lord in peace, and Mrs. Cochran continued to live in the cottage next to the hotel as a beloved member of the OCF White Sulphur Springs family until her death in 1995. After the 1978 purchase, OCF immediately set to work making necessary improvements to meet the needs of the ministry and current safety codes. The main hotel building was renamed Harrison House in honor of Lieutenant General William K. Harrison, Jr., former OCF president, and his wife Eva. The log cabin was designated Fort Cochran in tribute to Paul and Patricia. In 1993, OCF acquired a large parcel of adjoining land to bring the total center acreage to 1,050. And as the new century dawned, with the growing ministry pushing venerable Harrison House beyond capacity, plans were developed to build the new Heritage House while carefully preserving all of the original White Sulphur Springs facilities. Today, Harrison House still welcomes guests in serving the Lord and OCF, its strength a testament to the quality of craftsmanship from well over a century ago. It also is home to the White Sulphur Springs Museum and Archives, where cases made of native cherry wood display artifacts telling the remarkable story of God's hand in providing faithful stewards who built and passed along the tradition of hospitality that welcomes and embraces guests today. If you'd like to learn more about White Sulphur Springs history, 2 books are available in the Heritage House bookstore. Where Cares Refuse to Stay, its title taken from a 1950s hotel advertising slogan of the Cochrans, tells the story of Milligan's Cove hospitality and the construction and operation of White Sulphur Springs as a public resort by the Colvins and Cochrans. In 2 Lives of Devotion, Patricia Cochran recounts how she and her husband were moved to save White Sulphur Springs and then tenaciously safeguarded until the Lord brought them together with OCF. We hope you've enjoyed this glimpse into the history of White Sulphur Springs. During your stay, be sure to set aside some time to visit Harrison House and all the buildings forming the historic heart of this very special place apart, place of the heart, where God has transformed countless lives over the decades, and His glory continues to be manifested every day in a multitude of ways.